I'm so happy to have Pearl McHaney back with us this year. Pearl is a wonderful friend of Women Alone Together. She has just retired in May from Georgia State University, where she was the Kenneth M. England Professor of Southern Literature. And she has written 7 books, either written or edited 7 books. She has so many accomplishments. She was also an associate dean at the university, and she won the 2017 Governor's Award in Arts and Humanities for our state for her accomplishments. She is a Eudora Welty Scholar, and she appeared in 2012. And some of you remember when she talked about Delta Wedding, and we loved that evening with her. And then her husband, Tom McHaney, who is a Faulkner scholar, came and spoke to us in 2014 and presented The Unvanquished by William Faulkner. And then this is the nicest thing that Pearl did to say that she's a friend of us. I was at the Carter Center one night and saw Pearl, and she came up to me and said, "Do you know who Caroline Miller is? And are you familiar with her book, Lamb in the Bosom?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "Well, you should be, and I'll be happy to come to Women Alone and talk about it." And I was astounded because, as you remember, Caroline Miller was the first Georgia woman to win a Pulitzer. And she won it for her book, Lamb in the Bosom, which is fabulous. I have recommended it to so many people. And she was such an inspiration to Margaret Mitchell. Margaret Mitchell said that Caroline Miller was her favorite writer, and she owed a debt of gratitude to her. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Pearl McHaney because she has been so good to us. And we're so pleased that she is here with us tonight to talk about Delia Owens and her debut novel. Hey, that's not a bad way to start out with your novel writing, to be on the New York Times bestseller list for 100 weeks. And they said that she has hit the jackpot or won the Triple Crown because in 2019, she sold more books than Margaret Atwood, John Grisham, and Stephen King combined. Isn't that amazing? So I turn it over to Pearl McHaney now.
I'm really delighted to be here, and I think Women Alone Together is such a marvelous idea that Carolyn has put together, and it's so successful. I know Georgia State has rewarded her by giving her an alumni award in part for this. And I think using Zoom to be able to bring people from far away has this marvelous, I'm just going to say a tiny little plus of the pandemic, because it just offers something different. And you're a bit like Delia Owens and a bit like Kaya Clark to be able to take advantage of what might seem like a disadvantage. So I'll go ahead and start. I'm kind of assuming that you have read the book, but you might not have read it recently. I'm not necessarily going to tell you the answer to the mystery of the murder, but you might intone it. I'm not going to address that. I'll
Probably they have all read it.
Probably,
So
but
I'll just say that. Okay.
So I want to start with the title. I almost always like to start with looking at the book, the title. What does that mean? So Delia Owens tells us in that little video we saw that this is a saying from her mother. Delia Owens grew up with a twin brother and with 2 other siblings. And her mother would say, yes, go out where the Crawdads sing. So she uses this idea. And in the novel, it's referred to, Kaya says that her mother said it, but Tate Walker has just said it. And Kaya responds that, oh yeah, that's where far in the bush where critters are wild, still behaving like critters. And then she says to Jody, when he comes back, her brother, her next oldest brother, 6 years older than she, says, I forgive Ma for leaving, but I don't understand why she didn't come back. In nature, out yonder where the crawdads sing, the 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 I can't even read my writing. Um, these ruthless seeming behaviors actually increase the mother's number of young over her lifetime. And the mother, so in other words, the mother leaves to survive. So we know this in our current day that lots of times women need to leave whatever situation has caged them or trapped them or traumatized them or threatened them or kept them from being their true full selves. And what Kaya has learned by observing nature, what Delia Owens has observed in Africa with all of that, is that the women, the females stick together for multiple reasons, and we'll come back to that. But this idea of going out into the wild, um, and Owens admits and studies and says, oh yes, I know now that crawdads don't sing. But what happens is the title is both a kind of a literal thing, go out where the crawdads sing and find that particular place. And Owens is going to tell us where that is. But it's also completely metaphorical. Kaya survives and uses her experiences to learn to stay wild. She avoids people. She avoids the typical critical experiences such as school or socializing. She hides from the law, from the truant officers. She hides from the people her own age. So we see that this idea of nature versus nurture is pulled into question completely by the novel. So nature, that is to say those things that are hereditary, genetic, things that are passed on down to you versus nurture. And there was just a book review recently, the beginning of this month, of a book named Unique, The New Science of Human Individuality by David Liddon. And I was thinking about crawdads, and he says, even though this doesn't sound as clever and quick as nature versus nurture, this is how he defines that dichotomy. It says, through hereditary interacting with experience, filtered through the inherent randomness of development. So you've got the hereditary, the nature, the genetics, interacting with experience, survival in Kaya's case, learning how to live alone, how to find food, how to eat off the land and the sea, filtered through the inherent randomness of development. So what does Kaya have for development? She doesn't have her family. So she has to figure out how to use her nature, her inherited gifts, to nurture herself through her experiences and to let the natural world be a part of both the hereditary, because she is a human being, a mammal species, and the nurture altogether. So I think that makes, to me, that gives the novel this additional layer of trying to understand how one develops, how one becomes who they are. She learns from the marsh waters, from the birds and the fish, how to be both an individual and a survivalist in a sense, but also to figure out how to be a part of the pride of lions or the herd of elephants or the troop of the brown jackals that Owen understood. So both Owens and Kaya, I'm trying to suggest, transform the place or the state of being where the crawdads sing into a metaphoric and poetic space where the wilderness and the wild creatures, herself included, and Delia Owens included also, are safely and by choice isolated. And then to turn what might be a loneliness into a solitude. So this difference between isolation and being contentedly alone, I think, is also at work here. Delia says on her website, when you can feel the planet between your toes and the trees moving about You must listen with all your ears, and I promise you will hear the crawdads sing. And this is what she said on the video also, that this is where the crawdads are singing. In fact, she continues, it will be a chorus. And in Crawdads, Tate thinks about Kaya. This is quite near the end. He thinks, quote, and it's in italics to show that he's thinking, she feels the pulse of life because there are no layers between her and the planet. And so this is like in the Elizabethan era, this is the music of the spheres, or it might be what we could talk about as the calmness in the storm, or it's what Mary Oliver, the poet, says about going to Walden. Any of us could go to Walden, Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Or maybe it's even the quiet place achieved in meditation. And so where the crawdads sing is very specific to this this eastern coastal Carolina marsh and swamp area. It's also part of the, I was going to say intimate, but it seems so not intimate, but the wildness of the Idaho scenes that we just saw in the video. And it's also what Owens feels in the mountains of North Carolina, where she spent her summers. So the title gives you all kinds of things to go on. Now, I think I've admitted to many of you before, but I'll make a big announcement right here. I'm a Yankee. So I wasn't even sure what crawdads were when I first heard the title, but I learned. So the title can be anything. And then Owens uses it like many, many authors do. It comes up in the book and gives you definitions there. So let's back up just a little bit. So we've got this title working physically, metaphorically, and practically, but it takes an individual to be alone enough or isolated enough to hear the singing, the chorus, the meaning, the solitude, any of that. So I think that the central conflict or the central driving force in Crawdads is this solitary search to hear the crawdads with the oppositional pull or yearning to belong, to be part of a group, to be connected. And that connection is what Owens observed in Africa. And it's also what she says drove her to write this particular novel. So she didn't write a memoir. I was talking with Carolyn earlier on why she's writing a novel instead of writing a memoir. And my neighbors here say, oh, now that you're retired, you can write your memoirs. And I go, oh, no, forget it. I don't want to do that. But I keep saving little pieces of things. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, this is a fiction, a novel, and yet it's very much drawn from life. All writing is drawn from life. You can't write in a vacuum. You're using things or you're putting things together. How did you learn those things? But it's drawn from life. For 23 years, Owens lived pretty much alone. Part of that 7 years was solitary, alone, not in the camp with her then husband, Mark Owens. She lived in the Kalahari. She lived in Zambia. She lived in the Luanga River Basin. And she was observing. We heard, and you know, she is a zoologist, well-trained. And what she's trained to do is to observe. And so she observed very closely and for a long time the herds of elephants and the troops of baboons and the prides of lions. And what she recognized as a scientist observing this, and I believe because she is a female, she realized that the females were bonding for protection, for food, for their young, and sometimes even definitely against the males who were primarily interested in procreation. So the males would leave the family unit and go off to find other females to procreate with. That was their whole job. That's their work. But the females all stayed together. So they were holding together. So she compares that, or she draws on that experience, as well as holding on to her childhood. She had 3 really close friends, and she dedicates Where the Crawdad Sings to them, to Amanda Walker Hall, to Amanda's identical twin sister, Margaret Walker Weatherly, and to Barbara Clark Copeland. And these were her childhood friends. And she uses that in the naming of her characters. For example, the pseudonym that Kaya uses for her poetry is Amanda Hall, A.H. And one of her oldest sister is Amanda Walker Clark, combining the names of those identical twins. And Tate's last name is Walker, again, referencing those particular twins. She also uses other people from her town of Thomaston, which is a small town, South Georgia. I don't know, small. I just made that part up. I don't know how small or large it is, but it's not huge. But Thomasville is sort of between, let's see, I wrote it down because I looked it up, between Bainbridge and Valdosta, and it's just north of the Florida line, just north of Tallahassee. So it's far south. But she uses another friend's name, Napier Murphy, and she references him in her acknowledgments. And that is the name of her, one of her brothers is called Murph, and it comes from a grandfather's name. There was an African-American gentleman, older, that Delia Owens used to go and visit with her father, she said, who is the prototype for Jumpin'. And there are several features of her hometown of Thomasville. There was a pool hall that had a side window built into it where you could go up to the window and get a hot dog and a Coke. There was, of course, every town had a water tower, and that water tower sort of stands in and transforms into the fire tower in the novel. She spent summers, as I said, in the North Carolina mountains, and she now lives in Asheville. And so Asheville becomes a place, even though that's one of the criticisms of the novel, that no one would have traveled from the coast nearly an entire day's trip at that time to the Asheville. There were other closer cities. But this is Owens writing her first novel. And so she's drawing on the city that she knows rather than necessarily researching and having them go to Wilmington to buy the bicycle that Tate wants, for example. And there's not even really, there's no Veterans Administration offices in Asheville. There are many others closer when Pa goes to check on his army, what the army owes him, for example. But anyway, so she's drawing from this childhood and then from her professional life also to try and figure this out. In 2019, because the novel was so successful, Putnam put out a deluxe edition, another way to make more money and sell more issues. And now probably people, after all this time, more than 2 years on the bestseller list, it's no longer in the top 10, but I think that's probably because people now are going to wait and see the movie. But anyway, we'll come back to that. But in the deluxe edition, Owens writes a letter to her readers, and I'd like to read that to you. My feeling of being cut off from others or from old connections worn thin turned into a burning urge to write a novel about how much I learned about myself and others watching lions and elephants and brown hyenas. Since we inherit much of our behavior, how does someone forced to live beyond our genetic map behave? So forced to live beyond our genetic map, whatever we perceive that to be, how do we behave? So being isolated so much, that's beyond our genetic map. We're social beings, okay? How do you behave? For example, she writes, if a young girl had to grow up mostly alone, how would rejection, discrimination, and isolation change her? And this is one of the reasons I think it's a really perfect novel for women alone together to be thinking about at this time during the pandemic, because we are out of our genetic maps, in a sense. We are forced into a different kind of isolation, a different kind, people are having to cook dinner instead of go out. We meet on Zoom instead of hugging one another in person and seeing one another. Owens continues, we can find unbelievable strength deep inside to survive, even thrive when we are alone. And when we are whole, we are more likely then to find a group. So to me, this is the whole definition of women alone together. We find strength in being alone, and we build ourselves individually. We even thrive, she suggests. And then when we are whole, we are more likely to find a group again, is what she writes there. So this is really moving away from the specific plot. So I want to move now to say, well, okay, so this is a good idea. I like this. Nature versus nurture, isolation versus group bonding. But how to tell a story of such a girl? What should we do? A story that is based on Owen's formal education, her family upbringing, and yet she sets it wholly in a wholly different ecology. But she relies on the time of her own youth and young adulthood, so she can identify with how Kaya comes of age, for example. And Owens is just a few years older than Kaya, giving her that little bit of extra wisdom, I think. She said it took her 10 years to write. And even as Carolyn introduced the idea of me speaking about this novel, I hadn't read it yet, but I knew it was immensely popular. I knew my other book club was going to be reading it eventually. So I said, okay, well, sure, I'll read it. But my first question was, what makes this book so immensely popular? You know, how did that come about? There are 7 million copies purchased worldwide, 6 million in the United States. It's in many other languages, Spanish and Chinese and Persian. Of course, it certainly helped that Reese Witherspoon chose it for her novel. And I couldn't help when I first started hearing Delia and watching Delia Owens on different YouTubes and what we just saw from the video that Steve organized for us to see. She sounds like Reese Witherspoon, or I should say Reese Witherspoon sounds like her, or there's that Southern accent and there's that charm and that, oh, you want to be Delia Owens' friend, I think. You want to be Reese Witherspoon's friend. And so if Reese Witherspoon says, hey, this is my good read for right now, okay, that is the push that the novel received. But is that enough for it to be on the bestseller list for 2 years? You know, they had to change the bestseller list when Harry Potter just took off and every slot was taken from Harry Potter. And that's why they they created a separate list for chapter books or for serial books, and then for YA books, and then for children's books, because the adults were not getting any of their books on there. So they made a new list. Anyway, so one of the great things about this novel is that it isn't fixed in one particular genre. Owens points this out. She says, yes, it's a murder mystery and a courtroom drama and a nature ode to nature. So in that way, it can appeal to an enormous variety of readers. Well, that's where I started when it said so popular. Because, it's a whodunit. The first page, you find out there's a dead man at the bottom of the fire tower. Okay, who did it? Why? How? So you have all those questions to be able to go through. And you toggle then back and forth between the growing up of Kaya and the murder, the looking for clues, and then into the courtroom drama. So it goes back and forth in time. And just when you don't really know where you are, you come back to the present moment. And that drives the plot, because we've got to keep finding out a little bit more about that as we find out about Kaya and who she is. So we have that. Then secondly, it's a female Bildungsroman, a female coming of age, a female novel of education is what the German word means. And it's only in the last quarter of the 20th century that people started saying, how come all the Bildungsromans are for men? They're all about boys getting an education and growing up, moving from innocence to experience. And we began to say, hey, young women also grow up and move from innocence to experience. So let's hear those stories and we can make a new category. And so this is the story of a young girl and her experiences. And we're pulled in immediately, at least I am, because it is Kaya's point of view. And so you have this innocent, young, creative, natural. I mean, she doesn't put on airs. She's just acts very intuitively and naturally. Tate points that out to her. She's creative. She's intelligent. She thinks. She's very talented. Maybe that's inherited from her mother, who we have these ideas and we see that she was a painter. She has empathy for the birds and for the sea life and for nature itself. And therefore, we have empathy for her. So it's working all the way around. She's a survivor. We are rooting for her. And then she actually is so successful by publishing these books. And we want to see, oh, I want to see those pictures of those feathers and those eggs and those birds. I want to read those descriptions. I want to see what her books are. So we're drawn in right away because we want her to succeed. We want her to find love. We want her not to throw stones at Tate when he comes back. We want her to accept him. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that it's a family story. And all of us either have family or we don't have family. We either want family or we're rejecting family for the moment. And so that appeals to anyone and everyone. So we have throughout this novel, will Ma come home? Will Jody come back? She's looking for family. In chapter 9, she says that Jumpin' and Mabel may be family. In chapter 11, she says, the marsh is all the family I got. Chapter 12, how would it feel to be among them, meaning these young girls, these people on the beach that include Chase. In chapter 18, she says to Tate, why would a mother leave her offspring? This is her question always. And then in chapter 30, people don't stay. And this is her trauma, that people leave. When I was rereading it for today, as the first chapter is called Ma. And I thought, yeah, but this isn't, Ma's not speaking. What's going on here? And then the second chapter is Jody, but we're just, you know. And then I realized these chapters are titled for the people who leave. Ma leaves, then Jody leaves. Then already we have Chase is dead. Then Kaya leaves civilization after one day in school. Then Pa leaves for Asheville and then for good. And then Tate leaves. And so that's what comes to her throughout. Everybody is leaving. And it's what she cannot get over, because the only creatures that don't leave are her gulls. They always come back. Why? Because she always feeds them, because she's always there for them. And that's how she defines family. You're there for one another. So we have the murder, the family. We also have a love story. Okay, everybody likes a good love story, right? And everybody likes a good guy to root for. I mean, we're all on the Tate team, right? And we don't like Chase because he's all the bad men we've had in our lives or read about. So how can you go wrong if you're writing a love story, if you want a popular? And then you have a courtroom drama. And so everybody that's thinking about Atticus Finch and To Kill a Mockingbird, here we have another courtroom drama. And you're probably seeing Gregory Peck when you're thinking about that defense guy. And Kaya's just sitting there, just quiet. So we have all of these different kinds of stories that are being told. And just when you might not want to suspend your disbelief about something in one part of the story, you get another part of the story or a different story. And so you forget, like, okay, well, I'll accept that. I'll go on because I want to see what's going to happen. And so even those people, which is just a very small percent, those people who on Goodreads, for example, don't like the novel and they have complaints about the novel and they are more sophisticated reader. They wanted something different. But there are a lot of people, especially during a pandemic, although this was popular way before the pandemic, but a lot of people they read for their entertainment. They read for their relaxation. They read for, they might be read for learn. You could read for learning because that's another part of this novel. If you want to learn about nature, you want to learn about the marsh and the swamp, that's there too. So those are some of my answers for why it is so popular. But there are a lot of other mysteries, which I think also pull a reader in. Things that you can't necessarily solve, things that keep you wondering. For example, who is Tate to Kaya? It's way toward the end that we find out that Tate was the kind of person he is right from the beginning, from his own early age. And maybe that's why he was looking out for Kaya all along. Where did her mother go? We find that out much later. Where did she go? I think we are contemporary and modern enough to know why she left. Like, she was brave. The bravest thing you can do is leave your children. Well, for years I thought, oh, what's the thing I'm going to say to my children that's going to like stick in their heads forever, that's going to hold it against me? And then I realized, oh, I already did it. I divorced their father. So, okay, that's done. We can move on. And we did. But so we know why she leaves, but where did she go? And we wonder with Kaya, will she return? I wonder, is Tate's guilt about the mother, his mother and his sister who were killed in the car accident going to Asheville to buy him his birthday bicycle, is that the same guilt that makes him leave Kaya and not face that? Is that the same guilt that then is manifested by not paying attention to his father's ill health, who then dies very quickly, very soon after the funeral, maybe like just a few days, and after the verdict is decided? I wonder, will the black and white racial tensions grow or develop or be something more? Remember, 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education. The schools are not integrated yet when Kaya takes her first day and last day in class. And it's not until the judge rules that Jumpin and Mabel can sit with the white people in the classroom, in the courthouse, that comes up again. But we definitely see that racial tension. It's a story about town versus marsh or swamp people. That's a sort of like a town versus country, the city folks versus the rural folks, this clashing of worlds, two different worlds, and how they're going to get along. And we're reminded by Maya Angelou, and then again by Natasha Trethewey, who just wrote a new introduction to Welty's One Writer's Beginnings, that we have to see how much more similar we are than how different we are. It's also the question of formal versus practical education. Are the family, the guiding people in Kaya's life wrong not to help her go back to school? Are you with Jumpin when he helps her evade the social services? Balancing that off against being sort of a parental figure for him. And why is Tate so good? Are there really people like that are so good? And why is Chase so bad? This is sometimes one of the criticisms, that the characters are not developed well enough, that they are stereotypical, and we know how they're going to behave. But why did Tate teach her how to read? Why did he respect her, unlike the other males, and then forget her? Why do we have these? Why does Chase wear that shell necklace? Is that just a plot device, or are we asked to have some empathy and understanding of Chase? Is he just controlled by his environment, the social environment and social pressures, to be, the macho person? Would he really have waited a whole year before he forced himself on Kaya? Why does Kaya take that necklace off of him? how does she lure Chase to the fire tower at just the right moment and time that perfectly? What responsibility does Kaya have to make a greater effort to join? What is her ultimate guilt? Would you have pushed her to be more of a joiner? Would you have hope for that? And then how does she justify her actions? She justifies her actions based on her understanding of male and female species that she observes and that she reads about. And so she lets herself be that wild thing where the crawdads sing. So we have all these different questions. I was wondering too, how am I doing on time, Carolyn? Do I have another 5 minutes?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. I wonder also what we should learn from the male characters. I mean, it's beautiful and wonderful and powerful to follow Kaya's growth, and then her triumph of knowing herself, understanding her species so well that we come to the conclusion of the novel. But what about the male characters? What about Pa? Here he has a different sort of guilt from the war. He certainly has PTSD. He has the trauma of the war, but he has the additional guilt of not protecting his brothers in the trench and being rewarded for a mistake, or mistakenly rewarded, I should say. So he has that guilt, and it drives him to drink and to violence. What about Jumpin'? What should we think about him? Is he so understanding because he and Kaya are the same in their difference, in the discrimination and the prejudice against them? And what about Scupper Walker, Tate's father, who again seems like the ideal father? He listens, he works, he understands, he encourages, he teaches Tate what it is to be a man, allow feelings. So what about those male characters that are in there? And then what about the next generation of the male characters? What about Jody? He's educated in a kind of a GI Bill after the 2 tours in Vietnam. But he's pretty guilty of not looking for his mother. He's guilty of abandoning Kaya and of not coming back until way too late. And what about Tate? He decides, for all the great things that he does, he stands back too far, and he decides for Kaya. He makes up her mind in a way that she would not be able to fit in. He doesn't give her the choice. He decides for her. But he teaches her many things. And does it balance out then, is what I'm wondering. Now, Owens talks about Tate as the evolved male, like what we hope males will evolve into. So there'll be more than just Tate and Scupper and Jumpin'. And she talks about Chase as the unevolved male, who's showing off, she says, his secondary sex characteristics, his fancy speedboat, and his belief that he can win Kaya just by all that he has to offer. And he does. He's going to be pretty happy if he gets this arrangement of having the marriage that everybody expects him to have, dinner on the table every night, and then he's got his little mistress off in the woods all to himself. So there's lots of questions, I think, and that, in a sense, makes something a good novel, a good read. It looks like maybe they're stereotypical. It looks like she has it wrong about the geography. Apparently, she also has it wrong about a lot of the nature things and the species that she's describing. People complain about the dialect, but it pulls you in and it keeps you turning the pages. That's the meaning of a page turner. You turn the pages. You have short chapters and you find out this and then you find out that. It's a page turner. And it has all these unresolved questions, so you get to participate in the story. How could that happen? Wait, why did we have to have that sex scene? But I kind of, it was kind of interesting. So you have this pull. But aside from that, one of the beauties of the novel, I think, is the absolute lyricism of it. It starts with a prologue, and I'll just read a couple of paragraphs of the prologue because it sets up beautifully what's going to happen. I think the prologue should be here before part one, so there's a prologue to both parts, but I don't know, her editor didn't catch that. Anyway, the prologue. 1969. The marsh, naming it, proper name. It's not the marsh, it's marsh. Marsh is not swamp. Marsh is a space of light where grass grows in water and water flows into the sky. Slow moving creeks wander, carrying the orb of the sun with them to the sea. And long-legged birds lift with unexpected grace, as though not built to fly, against the roar of 1,000 snow geese. Then, within the marsh, here and there, true swamp crawls into low-lying bogs, hidden in clammy forests. Swamp water is still and dark, having swallowed the light in its muddy throat. Even night crawlers are diurnal in this lair. There are sounds, of course, but compared to the marsh, the swamp is quiet because decomposition is cellular work. Life decays and reeks and returns to the rotted duff, a poignant wallow of death begetting life. And then we hear about the murder. So right away, we set up the dichotomy of the marsh filled with light and life, and the swamp filled with darkness and murk. I don't know if that's a word, murkiness and death. And part one is the marsh and the growing up and the beauty of discovering enough, the power of survival, the pride of survival, of figuring things out, even though she doesn't know what comes after 29. And part two is the swamp, the dark, deadly loss, isolation, rather than pride in most parts. So you have that beautiful lyricism there. Then secondly, incredible figurative language. Often, especially at the beginning when we're meeting Kaya, but then also throughout, all of these metaphors and similes for Kaya relating her to the natural world. I'll give a few examples. Her hair was the black of crow wings. She was trying to disappear like a bark beetle. After the school experience and the phonics lesson, she could coo like a dove. She learned not to act like a predator. She flattens herself up against the Frigidaire like roadkill, like a roadkill stork. She's trying to hide. She thinks of herself as a bird lifting off. And then she is worried. She is like the underbelly of a porcupine. She was exposed. In other words, the porcupine's needles of protection aren't there. She talks about the wooing of female birds, but Kaya is young for nesting. She might spring like a startled fawn. The Social Security Administration would pull her, quote, in like a trout. And then later, she feels as if she is seaweed dragged on a line. She's hiding like a spotted fawn. And then the judge says, when he had seen her in town through the years, she looked like a coon from a rubbish bin. And he's got to change his mind about that too. So you've got this beautiful language marrying the natural world with the isolation and also the growth and maturity and strengthening of Kaya. Thirdly, for its beauty, we have poetry. And I don't necessarily mean Amanda Hall's poetry, which I also pretty much skipped over most of the time because I didn't think it was very good. Even Tate says it was a bit weak. But this beautiful scene with Tate's father, who recalls his memorization of Sam McGee, uh, and he teaches his son that poetry makes you feel something. Poetry can make you feel something. And then he defines a man. Let me read that. It says, the whole point of poetry, they make you feel something. His dad had told him many times that the definition of a real man is one who cries without shame, reads poetry with his heart, feels opera in his soul, and does what's necessary to defend a woman. So poetry helps you feel. And that lesson is really beautiful. And then she uses this poem from Thomas More, the Ballad of the Lady of the Lake of the Dismal Swamp. And that comes up many times. And whenever I see a epigraph, for example, from a poem, I always want to go and find out where that epigraph came from. And so this ballad is a real ballad, and the British man, Thomas More, he came to the New World around the turn of into the 19th century. And he was in Norfolk, Virginia. And he says, there's this story. They tell of a young man who lost his mind upon the death of a girl he loved, and who, suddenly disappearing from his friends, was never afterwards heard of, as he frequently said in his ravings that the girl was not dead, but had gone to the dismal swamp. And it is supposed he wandered into that dreary wilderness and had died of hunger or been lost in some of the dreadful morasses. And here's the poem. They made her a grave too cold and damp for a soul so warm and true. And then this next line is where the quotation begins in the novel. And she's gone to the lake of the dismal swamp, where all might long by a firefly lamp. She paddles her white canoe. And her firefly lamp I soon shall see, and her paddle I soon shall hear. Long and loving our life shall be. And I'll hide the maiden in a cypress tree when the footstep of death is near. That's just 8 lines of 40 lines. I encourage you to go ahead and look that up, the ballad, The Lake of the Dismal Swamp. But there we have the fireflies. And we have fireflies instead of, as one critic said, it should be lightning bugs on the coast. But that's why it's fireflies, because of this poem. And we have the white canoe, and we have Tate trying to protect her and yet let her grow. So you have this poetry throughout, and she quotes, Owens quotes a few other poets before she starts writing her own. She says, words in poems do more than say things. Words in poems do more than say things. You might think about that for when Natasha Trethewey is speaking to you later next year. And lastly, there's nature. We see in where the Crawdads sing the best of the natural world and some of the worst of the human nature. So you have these ideas. She read that one beautiful line, sand keeps secrets better than mud. And on the next page in the novel, shells, the best secret keeper. So if you read the novel a second time, you're going to see all these beautiful clues, because the first time, typically, whenever we read a novel, we're just reading to find out what happens. Like, okay, what happens? This is what I call my recreational reading when I was still teaching. I didn't have to use a pencil. I didn't have to use the computer. I didn't have to look things up. I didn't have to think about how it was structured. I just could turn the pages and find out what's going to happen next. But when you read a novel the second time, you find out how the author figures out how to have this happen next and next and next. And that's when you see the poetry or the lyricism, or you feel nature. There's a beautiful feather game. And don't you just wish someone was playing the feather game with you? And then she's reading Aldo Leopold, his soft words sounding almost like poetry. If you still have a copy of the book, or if, I don't know how you find it on Kindle, but in in the book, it's on page 113. I'll just read a couple of lines. And this is what she is understanding of what Leopold is saying. Aldo Leopold taught her that floodplains are living extensions of the rivers, which will claim them back anytime they choose. Anyone living on a floodplain is just waiting in the river's wings. She learned where geese go in the winter and the meaning of their music. His soft words, sounding almost like poetry, taught her that soil is packed with life and one of the most precious riches on earth, that draining wetlands dries the lands for miles beyond, killing plants and animals along with water. Some of the seeds lie dormant in the desiccated earth for decades, waiting, and when the water finally comes home again, they burst through the soil, unfolding their faces. This too is the whole metaphor or symbolic revealing of how the seed that is Kaya, 6 years old, abandoned, grows and flowers and flourishes in a sense. So the last thing I want to do is to suggest all kinds of other novels, or not novels, books, some novels, where if you like, especially the nature part of Where the Crawdads Sing, then I want to recommend to you this nonfiction, The Invention of Nature. It's the story of Alexander von Humboldt by Andrea Wolf, W-U-L-F. And he, from the beginning, he lived all of he was thinking and living and writing before the American Revolution. He's traveling in South America, and he is understanding and explaining how the volcanoes here on one continent are in connection with the volcanoes in Asia. He's understanding that all of life is connected together, and he's trying to protect that. And it's beautifully written. And then if you want a novel, I suggest The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is beautiful. Also, very different people, how they are connected, the connections that they do find, and then how they try to protect nature or understand nature. Of course, The Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. Also, this book, Saving the Georgia Coast, by Paul Bolster, who was a Georgia representative in the legislature. It's the political history of the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, and it's about the Georgia coast. And you think, okay, do I need a political book about this? Yes, you do. It's fascinating how things get made and unmade and done, but you also have the beautiful coast that is there. I recommend, of course, anything by Janice Ray, but Ecology of a Cracker Childhood, where again, what Delia Owens is trying to write about, how isolation is in confluence with belonging, and how difficult that is in nature, and how you have this isolated girl. Well, Ecology of a Cracker Childhood by Janice Ray is a memoir, but it's one chapter about her childhood growing up in a junkyard outside of Darien, Georgia. At the same time, it's about the longleaf pine and about the tortoise. And somebody said, well, why did you decide to write this as a contrapuntal story, your biography, your memoir with nature? And she says, well, I knew no one would read about a damn pine tree. But she also has written Drifting into Darien, which is a personal and natural history of the Altamaha River, Wild Card Quilt, An Ecology of Home, which goes to the soul family idea that you had an introduction to in Where the Crawdads Sing. And when Owens was asked, and you can read this on her website, she was asked, why the coastal, North Carolina coastal marshlands? And she said, well, when I was a girl, I went canoe camping with my mother in Okefenokee Swamp and other wild places. And then, but she says, I also chose North Carolina marsh because very little has been written about the historical population there. And then she worries, she says, well, I don't mean to leave out the Native Americans. And so that made me think of recommending Nowhere Else on Earth by Josephine Humphreys, which talks about the Lumbee Indians along the Lumbee River in I don't know, is that North Carolina? South Carolina, I believe.
Mhm.
So I wanted to mention those particular books, and let me look at my little cheat sheet here and see if I had something else. Oh, a beautiful book. If you're kind of fascinated with the kind of research that Owens did in Africa with elephants and with brown hyenas and with the baboons, then I recommend this other novel, which is also nonfiction, called American Wolf by Nate Blakesley. And he's talking about the, the, the wolves in the American West and the Canadian West, and preserving them, reintegrating them, the kinds of families, the kinds of dens they have. And it's also about the people who are watching, observing, the people who are working on all sides of the American wolf. And it chooses one particular wolf, I don't know, he has a number, and sort of following his families and how he goes. And so you sort of get that bonding piece that is there. I'm going to close with just saying that I'll try to answer your questions, but as you already recognize, I am not Delia Owens, and I'm not the author here. So I can't be like Joe Crispino, who could just talk on so beautifully. He also came to my book club, and yes, he can talk on, and it was wonderful. But I'll try to answer questions. But I just want to say thank you for inviting me to look at this book more closely and to share what I was thinking.